Hello. Road to GH will reveal Kristina carried within her a rage that had never subsided since the loss of her baby, a tragedy she firmly believed Ava had indirectly caused. Even though the court had declared Ava innocent, Kristina couldn't accept it. To her, justice had turned its back, and that betrayal ignited a fire inside her that only grew stronger with time. Every day, the pain of her loss twisted into something darker, something more dangerous. Words of reason from her mother, Alexis, and even from Lucky fell on deaf ears. Their attempts to calm her, to pull her back from the edge, only made Kristina feel more isolated, more misunderstood. Forgiveness no longer existed in her vocabulary. Her heart was consumed by the need for vengeance, to make Ava feel the same anguish she lived with every single day. In the days that followed, Kristina became a shadow of her former self. She drifted aimlessly, yet always with Ava on her mind. She began tracking Ava's movements, noting her routines with precision. Her thoughts, once filled with sorrow and grief, had turned sharp, singularly focused on retaliation. She told herself that Ava deserved everything that was coming. Justice hadn't come through the court system, Kristina would be the one to deliver it. Her plan wasn't elaborate, but it was driven by raw emotion and festering hatred. One evening, unable to restrain herself any longer, Kristina approached Ava's home under the cover of night. She wasn't entirely sure what she would do. Confront Ava? Destroy something she loved? But in her mental haze, her only goal was to cause pain. What she didn't expect was for Avery, Ava, and Sonny's young daughter to be inside. As Kristina crept through the house, emotions spiraling and hands trembling, she accidentally knocked over a heavy object from a high shelf. The crash was deafening, followed immediately by a piercing scream. When she turned, she saw Avery lying motionless on the ground, a thin line of blood trailing from the side of her head. Time froze. Kristina stood in paralyzing shock, her mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. The room was silent except for the sound of her own frantic heartbeat echoing in her ears. In that split second, every ounce of anger she had held onto melted into horror. She hadn't come to hurt Avery. She never even thought of the child. But now, because of her recklessness, because of her obsession with punishing Ava, an innocent child had been seriously hurt. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Her revenge hadn't just failed, it had turned her into the very monster she had sworn to destroy. When Avery was rushed to the hospital, the atmosphere was thick with panic and heartbreak. Ava clung to her daughter's small, motionless body as paramedics wheeled her through the emergency room doors. Her hands were shaking, her face pale, her voice trembling as she begged the doctors to do something, anything, to save her little girl. The wait was agonizing, each passing second stretching like hours as the medical team worked to assess the extent of Avery's injuries. After a flurry of tests and scans, the doctor returned with a solemn expression. He confirmed that Avery had sustained serious trauma to her head and a compound fracture in her arm. The blow had caused a deep laceration and possible internal bleeding, and she would need emergency surgery to relieve pressure on her brain. Ava's world collapsed in that moment. She broke down sobbing, crumbling under the weight of fear and rage. Her daughter was fighting for her life, and there was no one to blame but Kristina. But as devastated as Ava was, it was Sonny who burned with a deeper fury, one that surged through him like wildfire. He stood frozen for a moment when he heard the full story, his jaw clenched, his fists shaking at his sides. This wasn't just an accident. This was the result of blind hatred, of a twisted need for revenge that had spiraled out of control. And the fact that it came from Kristina, his own daughter, was more than he could bear. Sonny's heartbreak morphed into a cold, bitter fury. He stormed back to the house, where Kristina stood, visibly shaken, her eyes rimmed red with tears. But there was no room for sympathy in Sonny's heart. Without hesitation, without even letting her speak, he told her to get out. His words were sharp, final, and merciless. He didn't want to hear excuses, didn't want to know her reasons. All he could see was the image of Avery's small body lying unconscious in a hospital bed. That pain clouded everything else. Kristina stood in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. Her father, her protector, the man whose approval she had longed for her entire life, had just cast her out like a stranger. She tried to speak, her lips trembling, but no words came. Sonny didn't waver. He turned his back on her and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the doorway. The rejection hit her like a punch to the chest. Tears streamed down Kristina's face as she turned and ran into the night. Her thoughts were a storm of humiliation, anger, and sorrow. She felt betrayed, abandoned, humiliated beyond words. But even then, in the darkest corners of her mind, Kristina couldn't fully admit she had been wrong. In her heart, she still clung to the belief that Ava had deserved some kind of punishment. She couldn't reconcile her intentions with the tragic outcome. Now, cast out by her family and tormented by guilt she refused to acknowledge, Kristina disappeared into the shadows of Port Charles, alone, lost, and spiraling deeper into the consequences of a vengeance gone horribly wrong. While Avery was undergoing intensive treatment in the hospital, Ava was consumed by a relentless storm of emotions that refused to settle. Her grief was raw and unyielding, her fury a deep and rising tide that threatened to drown everything in its path. Watching her daughter, her innocent, vibrant little girl, lying pale and motionless under harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed in cold rhythm, was like being trapped in a waking nightmare. The sight of bandages wrapped around Avery's delicate arm, the bruises along her temple, and the doctor's cautious tone when discussing the swelling in her brain, all of it pierced through Ava's soul like knives. Every second that passed without answers or reassurance only added fuel to Ava's growing fury. Her mind could not, and would not, accept that someone like Kristina, someone who had once been part of her extended family, could be responsible for this tragedy. The fact that Kristina was Sonny's daughter didn't matter anymore. Blood ties meant nothing in the face of what had been done. Ava loved Avery more than anything in the world, and the idea that anyone, especially Kristina, had intentionally endangered her child made her physically sick with rage. This wasn't a moment of recklessness or a lapse in judgment, as some might try to argue. To Ava, Kristina's actions were rooted in obsession, in unresolved hatred, in a desire to destroy her. Avery had simply been collateral damage in Kristina's twisted pursuit of revenge. And that, to Ava, was beyond unforgivable. As Avery was wheeled into surgery to address the cranial swelling, Ava made a silent vow. Kristina would not walk away from this. There would be no forgiveness. No second chances. No redemption arc. Ava didn't care who Kristina's father was, or what tragedy had pushed her over the edge. What mattered now was justice. Swift, brutal justice. Determined to ensure Kristina faced the consequences of her actions, Ava immediately reached out to a high-powered criminal defense attorney. Someone who owed her a favor from years past and had a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. Without rest, Ava began to piece together everything she could to build a case. She ordered hospital records documenting Avery's injuries, requested video surveillance footage from the neighborhood surrounding her home, and began compiling a timeline of Kristina's known behavior leading up to the incident. She even started reaching out to people who might have witnessed Kristina's instability, neighbors, mutual acquaintances, even Lucky. Any statement, any detail that could prove Kristina's intent would be valuable in court. Ava wanted to make sure that once charges were filed, they would stick. She wasn't just aiming for a restraining order, she wanted Kristina behind bars. But as she prepared for the confrontation she believed inevitable, Ava received an unexpected shock. When she finally arrived at the last known location where Kristina had been staying, a small apartment outside of town, she found it completely abandoned. The front door was locked, the windows shut, and the mailbox overflowing with unopened letters. Neighbors reported not having seen Kristina for days. Her car was gone, her phone was disconnected, and there were no signs of a planned return. It was as if Kristina had simply vanished. The realization hit Ava hard. The person she had poured all her rage toward, the person she wanted to look in the eye and hold accountable, was gone. She had envisioned serving Kristina with legal papers, watching her flinch as the weight of her crime closed in. She had wanted to stand in court, to testify, to watch justice unfold in real time. But now, with Kristina missing, all of that was out of reach. Ava stood outside that empty apartment building for a long time, her fists clenched, her heart racing. There was a sharp sting of disappointment. She had wanted Kristina to suffer, to face the consequences directly. Yet strangely, behind the fury and frustration, there was also a flicker of relief. As much as Ava wanted justice, the thought of seeing Kristina again, of being reminded of the night her daughter nearly died, was enough to make her stomach twist. The absence of confrontation, while unsatisfying, offered a small, fleeting reprieve from the trauma she was still processing. Still, Ava didn't see this as over. Far from it. She knew that Kristina couldn't hide forever. One day, she would return, either by guilt, law enforcement, or simple necessity. And when that day came, Ava would be ready. She would have everything in place. She would make sure that Kristina answered for every bruise on Avery's body, for every tear that had fallen, for every minute of terror they had both endured. Justice had been delayed, but it would not be denied. Not while Ava still had breath in her body. Sonny stood at the center of a storm that threatened to tear his world apart, torn between two daughters, both his blood, both pieces of his heart, and yet both now tangled in a tragedy that left him utterly shattered. He felt powerless, suspended in the wreckage of what had happened, watching the people he loved most fall apart before his eyes. There was no clear right or wrong in this moment, only pain, raw, unrelenting pain that consumed him from the inside out. He thought of Kristina, his firstborn, and how she had once been the embodiment of strength and compassion. As a child, she was fiery, yes, but also full of love, always wanting to do what was right, always standing up for others. She had carried the burden of being the daughter of a mob boss with surprising grace for many years, forging her own identity, trying to separate herself from the darker parts of his legacy. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. Grief had twisted her heart. Rage had hollowed out her soul. And now, the girl he once knew seemed like a ghost. Consumed by bitterness, driven by revenge, and capable of harming an innocent child in her pursuit of justice. Sonny couldn't help but wonder, had he failed her? Had his violent past, his chaotic life, the instability he had brought into their home laid the groundwork for Kristina's downfall? Was her thirst for vengeance something she had learned, perhaps subconsciously, from watching him all those years? The thought was unbearable. He had spent a lifetime trying to protect his children from his sins. And yet, here he was, watching one daughter suffer in a hospital bed and the other disappear into exile, both broken in different ways, and somehow, he felt responsible for them both. Still, as much as his heart ached for Kristina, Sonny couldn't ignore the fact that Avery had been the one physically harmed. Avery, his sweet, wide-eyed little girl, who had always been a bright light in his life, was now recovering from injuries she should never have sustained. She was the innocent one in all of this, and Sonny knew he had to be her protector above all else. He couldn't allow his love for Kristina to cloud his duty as a father to Avery. That was a painful truth he had to accept, even if it meant turning his back on one child to defend the other. But the pain didn't stop there. It dug deeper every time he remembered the look on Kristina's face when he cast her out. Shock, devastation, betrayal. As much as he believed he had done the right thing in the moment, the image haunted him. He saw flashes of her childhood in that face, glimpses of the little girl who once clung to his hand in fear of thunderstorms, who begged him to tell her bedtime stories just to hear his voice. That girl was still in there somewhere, buried beneath years of trauma and resentment, and Sonny ached with the knowledge that he might have lost her for good. Caught between duty and love, between guilt and grief, Sonny found himself at a crossroads with no easy answers. How did a father choose between two daughters when both were victims in different ways? How did he hold Kristina accountable without abandoning her completely? How did he help Avery heal while also confronting the damage done by someone she once called her sister? There were no clean solutions, no perfect outcomes. Only sorrow, only regrets, only the unrelenting ache of knowing that no matter what he did, someone would be hurt. Both Avery and Kristina were a part of him, flesh of his flesh, heart of his heart. And now, both lived in pain, and so did he. Sonny was a man used to making hard decisions, but this was unlike anything he had ever faced. Because this time, the enemy wasn't a rival on the streets. It was the devastation within his own family. And for once, all the power, all the money, all the strength in the world couldn't fix what had been broken. In the darkness of an unfamiliar place, Kristina wandered aimlessly, weighed down by hatred, sorrow, and guilt. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't return, not yet. Deep down, a small part of her still longed for forgiveness, for the chance to go home. But with everything she had done, she couldn't help but wonder, was there anyone left waiting for her?